The mountain air should have tasted like freedom. Standing on the unfinished deck of my timber frame home, all I could taste was rust and dread. This place, every beam and joint was supposed to be my sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap Clint had built around me. My phone buzzed in my hand. A vile little insect. The screen lit up with his name, Clint. The text was as blunt as a hammer strike. Final payment due, or the rot starts tomorrow. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I looked up from the screen, my eyes instinctively finding it. There, on a massive support beam that held up the entire corner of the deck, was a patch that wasn't right. The rich golden hue of the fresh timber was stained with a sickly greenish black, the wood looking damp and spongy. It was a wound, a deliberate flaw. He'd shown it to me last week with a grim smile, calling it a little insurance. He knew I'd seen it. This text was him cocking the gun. For months I'd paid him, trusting the contractor my budget could barely afford. Clint, with his too easy smile and promises of pioneer craftsmanship. But the delays grew. The costs ballooned with mysterious material upgrades, and his demeanor shifted from friendly to threatening. The final invoice was a number that felt less like a bill and more like a ransom note. Pay, or my dream home would be structurally sabotaged before I even moved in. I stared at the green patch. Rot starts tomorrow. He could do it. A few strategic cuts, some compromise seals where no one would look. The house would stand long enough for me to pay him, then slowly, quietly begin to fail. I'd be left with a beautiful rotting shell. No, not this time. The anger that rose up wasn't hot. It was clear and sharp, like an ice pick. He thought he held all the power. He thought I was just a guy with a dream, easy to squeeze. My thumb swiped across the phone, closing his text. I opened my contacts and found the new number I'd saved just yesterday, after a sleepless night of online searches and whispered recommendations from other builders in the valley. The listing simply said, "The Inspector, Structural and Code, Independent." I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, this time feeling it fill my lungs with resolve. I pressed dial. The ringtone sounded once, twice in my ear. Then a click. A calm, professional voice answered. "This is the inspector." "I need an independent inspection," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My gaze was locked on Clint's cancerous little masterpiece on the beam. "Today." There was a pause on the line, just a beat. "Location?" I gave him the mountain address. "It's a timber frame, new construction, and I believe there may be intentional structural compromise." Another pause. This one felt heavier, understanding. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Do not touch anything. Do not confront the builder." "I won't," I said, and I meant it. The confrontation wouldn't be with fists or shouts. It would be with facts, on paper, signed by a professional. I ended the call and slid the phone into my pocket. I turned my back on the green stain, looking out instead at the vast, untamed valley below. The fight for my home wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time, I wasn't facing it alone. The inspector was on his way. Let Clint bring his rot. We were bringing the truth. I still remember the first time I unrolled those blueprints on the hood of my truck, the Montana wind trying to steal them away. The ink lines sketched out a dream I'd carried for 30 years, a timber frame home in the hills, all my own. That's when Clint pulled up in his spotless Big Sky Builder's truck. He had that easy local smile. "Wyatt," he said, shaking my hand with a firm, confident grip. "That's a fine dream you got on paper there. Let's make it real." We spent that whole afternoon going over every detail. I'm a retired engineer, so I appreciated his precision. He pointed to the plans, his finger tapping the great room. "We'll use Douglas fir from the mill down in Phillipsburg. Local materials, old world craft. That's my promise to you." He looked me right in the eye when he said it. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? His handshake felt like a contract. The progress shots in my mind are like a perfect sunny film reel. Watching those first massive posts and beams, the timber he promised, get craned into place was like watching my own skeleton rise from the earth. The smell of fresh-cut wood in that clear mountain air is a smell I'll never forget. I'd stand there after the crew left, the sunset painting the frame in gold and orange, thinking, I did it. This is actually happening. Every nail driven, every joint pegged, felt like a piece of my future getting locked into place. My life savings weren't just in a bank anymore. They were right in front of me, taking the shape of a home. I'd spent a career building things for other people. This was for me. Clint would stop by, clap me on the shoulder and say, "See, told you we'd get her up?" And I'd just nod, too full of gratitude to even speak. I had no idea that beautiful rising frame was just the set piece for a different kind of story altogether. I was watching my dream get built, but I was also, brick by brick, investing my entire life into a lie. The final invoice arrived on a Tuesday, and the number at the bottom stopped my heart. It was 30% over the quote Clint had given me just a few months ago. I stood there in the skeletal frame of my dream home, the scent of fresh-cut Douglas fir in the air, holding a piece of paper that felt like a betrayal. I found Clint near the foundation, checking a level. "Clint, we need to talk about this invoice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I handed him the paper. "This is way over. Unforeseen site complications. We walked this site together. You gave me that quote." He took the paper, his eyes scanning it without a flicker of surprise. The friendly, easygoing builder I'd hired was gone. In his place was a man with a cold, calculated calm. "Wyatt," he said, his tone flat, "building on a mountainside isn't like putting up a shed in a flat field. Ground shifts. Rocks appear. It's complex. The price reflects the work." "But 30%? I pressed. "What complications? We need an itemized list. This isn't what we agreed to." That's when his demeanor shifted entirely. The last pretense of camaraderie evaporated. He looked from the invoice to me, and then his gaze swept over the beautiful, vulnerable timber frame around us. His expression was no longer that of a builder, but of a man holding all the cards. "Pay up," he said, the word simple and heavy, "or things might get delayed." He let that hang in the cold mountain air for a moment before adding, "Moisture's a real problem up here. A structure left exposed, unfinished. It wouldn't take long for the wood to start sucking it up, warping, rot setting in. A real shame after all this work." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat, wrapped in the clinical language of construction. He was holding my home hostage. The very timbers I'd helped raise, the dream I'd poured my savings into, was now leverage The friendly handshake deal we had felt like a distant, foolish memory. This was the real price, and it wasn't just monetary. It was the cost of trusting the wrong person with everything that mattered. The first time I thought it was just bad luck. I'd come up to the site after a long day in town, the air smelling of pine and damp earth, and found a whole section of roofing felt on the north slope ripped clean through, flapping in the breeze like a surrender flag. It looked deliberate, the tier too straight to be the wind. Clint was up there with a couple of his guys. "Just an accident, Wyatt," he'd called down, not even looking at me. "Stuff happens. We'll patch it." But he didn't sound sorry. He sounded bored. Then came the rain forecast, a big spring soaker rolling in from the Pacific. I made a special trip up the day before to check the ceiling. The house was just a skeleton of beautiful hand-fitted timber. My dream starting to take solid shape. And there it was. A beautiful, expensive casement window on the west wall, fully installed, but the exterior sealant around the frame was completely missing. The gap was wide open to the coming downpour. If that rain got in, it would soak the sheathing, warp the frame. It could cause rot before the walls were even closed up. My stomach turned to ice. "Clint!" I found him by his truck smoking. "The west window, it's not sealed." He took a long drag. "Is that right?" "Huh. Must have slipped my guy's mind. He'll get to it." "It's going to rain tomorrow. A lot." "We'll get to it," he repeated, his voice flat. His eyes weren't on me. They were on my house, and there was no pride in them, only assessment. The dread solidified a few days later. I was checking the progress on the deck footings when one of the younger subcontractors, a kid named Leo who did the metal work, lingered after the others had left for the day. He scuffed his boot in the dirt, looking nervous. "Hey, man," he said, his voice low. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but it ain't right." He glanced toward the road, making sure we were alone. On the interior framing, for the non-load-bearing walls in the loft, Clint told me to swap out the galvanized fasteners. Said to use the cheaper, plain steel ones. "Where no one would see," he said. The words hit me like a physical blow. Untreated fasteners. In my mountain home where moisture from breathing and living would eventually find its way into the walls, they'd rust. They'd stain the wood. They'd fail. "Why?" was all I could manage. Leo just shook his head. "Saves $1.50 a box. He does it all the time." He hurried off to his car, leaving me standing in the twilight. It wasn't incompetence anymore. The torn felt, the unsealed window, the secret corrosive fasteners. They were choices. Small, malicious acts of sabotage, designed to look like carelessness. Clint wasn't just cutting corners. He was deliberately planting seeds of failure into the very bones of my dream. I looked up at the timber frame, dark against the purple sky. It wasn't just my house he was attacking. It was my future. And I knew then I couldn't let it stand. I was standing in the skeleton of my dream, the smell of fresh-cut pine in the air, when a truck with county markings crunched up the gravel drive. The inspector stepped out, a man built like a retired linebacker with a clipboard and a gaze that missed nothing. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Wyatt, show me." For the next hour I followed him in a silent, dreadful parade through the timber frames of my mountain home. He ran a hand along a post, his fingers pausing over a joint. He didn't say anything, just made a note. The hope I'd been clinging to began to feel very, very small. Then he pulled out a device that looked like a sci-fi handgun. "Thermal camera," he grunted, pointing it at the exterior wall we'd just sheathed. The screen on the back lit up with a horrifying rainbow. Where the solid wood beams met the insulation, the image blazed a furious red and orange. "Massive heat loss here," he said, his voice flat. "Your thermal envelope is Swiss cheese. This'll cost you a fortune to heat, and in a mountain winter, that's not just expensive. It's dangerous." My throat went dry. "But the insulation specs." He switched tools, pressing a moisture meter against a central support beam. The device didn't beep. It let out a sustained, piercing shriek. The digital readout flashed numbers that made my stomach drop. He showed me the probe. "See that? Green wood, cores saturated. This beam will rot from the inside out. It'll fail." The final blow came when he knelt by a crucial knee brace. He tapped one of the heavy-duty screws holding it to the post. "These are the fasteners you specified?" I nodded, remembering the expensive branded boxes Clint had shown me. The inspector dug into his bag, pulled out an identical-looking screw from his own kit, and held them side by side. In the sunlight, the difference was obvious. Mine were thinner, the metal a cheaper, duller gray. "Substandard," he said, the word final as a judge's gavel. "Wrong grade, wrong coating. They won't hold the load, not in a high wind zone like this ridge." He stood up, brushing the sawdust from his knees, and looked at me. For the first time, his stern expression shifted into something harder, colder. He wasn't looking at a building flaw anymore. He was looking at a crime scene. "This isn't negligence, Wyatt," he said, his voice low and certain. "Negligence is forgetting a vapor barrier. This?" He gestured at the green beam, the thermal image, the fake fasteners. "This is sabotage. Piece by piece, system by system." He met my eyes, and I saw my own dawning horror reflected in his. "What you've got here isn't a home. It's a time bomb." The quiet of the mountain rushed back in, but now it felt suffocating. The house around me, every beam I'd helped raise, every nail I'd driven, was no longer my sanctuary. It was Clint's confession, written in wood and steel, waiting to collapse. The official envelope felt heavy in my hands, like it was filled with lead instead of paper. It was from the inspector's office. I tore it open right there in the driveway, the crisp mountain air doing nothing to cool the dread rising in my chest. The report was clinical, brutal, and devastating. Page after page detailed violations I hadn't even known to look for. It wasn't just sloppy work. The inspector had highlighted phrases like deliberate misalignment, concealed moisture traps, and systemic structural compromise. My eyes kept snagging on one sentence typed in stark, unforgiving black. "Based on the installed conditions, catastrophic envelope failure is projected within a 5-year time frame." My home, my timber frame dream, every beam and joint I'd saved for and planned around, it was built to rot from the inside out. Clint had engineered it to fail. My phone rang. The caller ID flashed his name. It was like he'd been watching me read it. I answered, my voice tight. "Clint." His laugh was a short, ugly bark through the speaker. "Got my report, did you? Told you I was the best. Pretty thorough, huh?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Price just went up again. That's for the stress of dealing with your nitpicking. So, you wiring the next payment, or do I start filing the liens?" I looked from the report in my hand to the soaring, beautiful shell of my house. I saw the deceptive strength of it, the hidden sickness Clint had built into its bones, all the frustration, the anxiety, the desperate hope for a reasonable end. It crystallized into something cold and hard. He wasn't a businessman driving a hard bargain. He was a saboteur. He'd taken my dream and weaponized it. Negotiation wasn't just impossible. It was a fantasy. You can't reason with a man who builds traps. The report is very clear, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'll be in touch. I hung up before he could laugh again. I wasn't going to argue or plead or try to find a middle ground that didn't exist. The inspector had given me the battle plan. Clint had just declared the war. It was no longer about saving money or finding a compromise. It was about saving the house. It was war. And for the first time, I finally knew who the enemy was. I sat at the rough-hewn table in my new home, the scent of fresh timber in the air. But all I could taste was bitterness. Across from me, the inspector spread out his own detailed reports next to my photos. "He's cut every corner in the book, Wyatt," the inspector said, his finger tapping a photo of a compromised roof joint. "This isn't just sloppy. It's a calculated pattern of fraud." I looked around at the walls I'd dreamed of for years. This was supposed to be my sanctuary. Clint had sold me a beautiful lie, and I'd paid for it with my savings and my trust. "So, what do?" I asked, my voice tight. "Sue him? That could take years." The inspector leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You go for the throat. His license is his livelihood. You present him with a choice so clear, so devastating, that fixing his mess becomes the only sane option he has." He slid a notepad toward me. "We draft a formal notice. Itemize every defect, cite the specific building codes he violated. Then you give him the ultimatum." For the next 2 hours, we worked. I wrote down every cracked beam, every improper fastener, every fire block he'd skipped. The inspector provided the technical language, the code sections, turning my frustration into a cold, hard document. Finally, we crafted the choice. The inspector dictated the final lines as I wrote them down. "Option 1, I read aloud, my hand steadying. "You, Clint, will fully remediate every listed defect at your own cost, under my supervision and the inspector's verification. All materials and labor will be to code, with no expense passed to me." "And option 2? I asked. The inspector's face was grim. "Option 2. The moment you refuse, I personally courier this entire package, our report, the photos, the notice, to the State Contractor Licensing Board, the county court, to initiate a fraud lawsuit, and his professional association, the SRO. We don't just suggest he might lose his license, we guarantee it. The fraud liability alone would bury him." I stared at the document. It was no longer just a list of problems. It was a weapon. I was holding the power to end Clint's career, to take from him what he had tried to take from me: a future. "He'll get the message," the inspector said, standing. "Men like him are bullies. They only understand one language: consequence." I signed my name at the bottom with a firm hand. The paper was no longer a plea for help. It was a declaration. He could fix the house, or I would break his entire world. The choice was finally his to make. The morning sun was just cresting the ridge, painting my timber frame home in a sharp golden light. It looked so strong, so honest, and today I was going to make sure it stayed that way. I stood on the gravel driveway, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs, with the inspector, a man of few words and a keen eye, solid as an oak beam beside me. Then I saw Clint's truck kicking up dust on the access road. My stomach tightened. This was it. He climbed out, his usual swagger in place, a false smile plastered on his face. Wyatt. Inspector. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to finally sign off on my masterpiece? I didn't return the smile. I felt a strange calm settle over me, colder than the mountain stream. We need to talk about your work, Clint. I reached into my folder and pulled out 2 documents. The first was the official stop work notice. The second was a copy of the inspector's report, its pages dense with technical violations and red flags. I held them out. His eyes flicked down. The color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy red. "What is this?" he snarled, snatching the papers. He scanned a few lines, his jaw working. "This is garbage. A hatchet job. You can't prove any of this." "The photographs prove it," the inspector said, his voice quiet but ironclad. He held up his tablet, displaying clear, time-stamped images of shoddy joinery, undersized fasteners, and foundation piers that didn't meet code, evidence that could sink his business. Clint's bluster turned to panic, then to a wild, cornered anger. He threw the papers to the gravel. "You know what? Fine, I walk. You finish your precious cabin yourself. Good luck finding someone to clean up this mess." He turned on his heel, heading for his truck. That's when the calm in me spoke. My voice was level, clear, and it stopped him in his tracks. "Walk," I said. "Then I call the sheriff for fraud. I call the state licensing board with this report, and then I call the Gazette. I'll make sure every homeowner from here to Missoula knows exactly who Clint is and what kind of masterpiece they can expect." He turned back, his face a mask of fury and fear. The inspector gave a single, firm nod, holding the tablet higher, the damning photos glowing in the morning light. Clint looked from my steady gaze to the inspector's unwavering evidence, then to the strong, silent frame of the home he'd tried to cheat. The fight went out of him like a deflating balloon. He didn't say another word. He just got in his truck, the door slamming with a final hollow sound, and drove away, leaving nothing but silence and settling dust. I looked at the inspector, then back at my home. It felt like the mountain itself had just let out a long-held breath. The silence after the shouting was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Clint stood there in the skeleton of my home, his bluster completely gone, just a hollowed-out man looking at the mountain of his own shoddy work. He nodded once. It was over. What followed wasn't a victory march, but something far more satisfying. A slow, painful reckoning. Under the unwavering, hawk-eyed watch of the inspector, who took up a permanent post with a folding chair and a clipboard, Clint's own crew had to undo every single one of their mistakes. I'd come up the mountain each morning with coffee, and the scene was the same. The grating whine of reciprocating saws cutting out their own poorly nailed beams, the dull thud of moldy insulation being ripped from the walls, the sour looks on the workers' faces as they installed the proper flashing they should have used in the first place. The inspector didn't say much. He just pointed. A tap of his pen on his clipboard meant a beam wasn't true. A slow shake of his head sent them back to re-shingle an entire section. He was a monument to code, and they were chipping away at their own failure, hour by expensive hour. The money was bleeding out of Clint's company in real time. I saw it in the way he'd stare at the lumber piles shrinking, his face getting tighter, grayer. He wasn't a villain up here anymore. He was a foreman watching his own bankruptcy being built, nail by nail. His crew's resentment towards him was palpable, a thick fog in the air alongside the sawdust. Then one crisp afternoon, it was finally done. The last piece of proper siding was nailed home. The inspector did his final walk-through, gave me a firm handshake and a nod, and left us in the quiet. The crew had already slunk away in their trucks. I stood on the porch of my now solid home, watching the final act. Clint was alone, loading the last of his tools into his battered pickup. He moved slowly, like every wrench weighed 100 pounds. He didn't look at me, didn't look at the house. He just stared at the truck bed. And there it was, fluttering under his windshield wiper. The official notice from the SRO. The bright yellow paper screamed its purpose even from a distance. License revocation. He saw it, froze for a long minute, then simply yanked it from under the wiper and tossed it onto the passenger seat like a piece of trash. But we both knew it wasn't trash. It was his epitaph. He got in, started the engine, a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet mountain, and drove down the switchback road for the last time. I didn't feel joy. I felt a deep, settling peace. The mountain was quiet again, and my home, at long last, was truly mine. The last of the sun's warmth soaks into the cedar planks of my deck as I watch the sky over the mountains bleed from orange into deep, cool purple. Months. It's been months since the last truckload of Clint's junk was hauled off the property. Months since the final inspection stamp was pressed into my permit. I take a slow sip of my beer, the silence around me not empty, but full. It's the sound of a house at rest. My mountain home stands solid behind me, its timber frame now fully enclosed, a tight, warm shell against the coming high country night. Every joint is snug, every window seals perfectly. The certificate of occupancy is framed inside, but the real proof is in the quiet. No wind whistles through cracks, no creaks echo from green wood settling. It's just peace. The crunch of gravel on the driveway is a friendly sound now. I don't even turn, just raise my bottle in a half salute as the inspector walks up, his own beer in hand. He doesn't wear the official vest anymore, not here. He just pulls up the other Adirondack chair and sits with a contented sigh. "She's holding," he says. Not a question, just an observation, as his eyes trace the roofline against the darkening sky. "She is," I agree. "Thanks to a good report." He nods, clinking his bottle gently against mine. A report just states the facts. The truth does the work itself. That's the heart of it all. Clint is gone, not run out by a fistfight or a shouting match, but by the unassailable documented truth of what he'd done. The faulty work, the violations, the danger, it was all there in black and white. The system, for once, worked exactly as it was supposed to. He faded away, a villain defeated not by a hero, but by a receipt, a photograph, a code citation. We sit without needing to talk, watching the first stars prick through the vast Montana twilight. The house, my home, feels like a living thing behind us, breathing softly. It's saved. More than that, it's realized. Every beam I raised, every nail I drove was a claim staked on this future, this quiet moment. I am at peace, a deep, settled peace that comes not from having won a battle, but from having built something true and having defended it with something just as true. The sunset fades completely, leaving the clean, dark silhouette of the peaks. The light from the windows spills out onto the deck, golden and steady. This is the end of that story, and the quiet beginning of everything else.